Huh. Huh.
Wow.
Welcome, everyone, to the Spirit of the Time Zoomcast. We're so excited to have you here today for our 35th time travel adventure with Richard Vaughn. We will get started right at the top of the hour. And welcome to the Spirit of the Time Zoomcast, and welcome to Zeitgeist Design and Production. I'm Becky Kiefer, Studio Director, and this is journey 35 of the Spirit of the Time Zoomcast. Here inside the Zeitgeist Creative Studio in Pasadena, California, imagination rules, and time is always of the essence. This is where immersion artists Ryan Harmon, Joe Cicero, and the world's top experienced designers study the past and spin the present envisioning the future of location-based entertainment, or what we call UXIRL, user experiences in real life. The Spirit of the Time Zoomcast offers a sneak peek behind the themes. Each month, we move you without a ride system, inviting one incredibly talented and influential colleague aboard our time machine. We set the controls for milestone moments in that person's career and attempt to unravel the mystery of what makes a guest experience timely yet timeless. And because we're live, you can type questions into the chat box and our passenger will answer them after the hour-long journey. Climbing aboard our time machine today is Richard Vaughn, celebrated designer, illustrator, and creative leader responsible for such classic experiences as Spaceship Earth at EPCOT, Catastrophe Canyon, and the backstage tour at Disney's Hollywood Studios, the Beatles Yellow Submarine attraction at the Sony Music Box in Berlin, and so much more. It's now my pleasure to introduce our time machine pilots, Zeitgeist President and Chief Creative Officer Ryan Harmon, and Zeitgeist Executive Vice President and Chief Art Director Joe Cicero, along with the world's only theme park designer to tour Japan multiple times, singing with his father's big band, the Billy Vaughn Orchestra, Richard Vaughn.
We are back. We are back. Oh my God.
Here we are.
I can't hear anything.
I know. We just came from 1859 in London. We were there for the first, that's what? We were there for the first clanging of Big Band. It's crazy. It was so loud, but Ryan, with all the concerts you go to and all the concerts I go to, it was nothing. It was like
Black Sabbath is louder for sure.
Yeah, Emerson, Lake and Palmer were definitely louder. But enough of this nonsense. We're here today to talk with the great Richard Vaughn. Richard, I so enjoy every moment that we had together at Imagineering. You're just such a positive, upbeat spirit, creative guy. And looking so forward to hearing all your great stories today.
And I met Richard in 1987 when I was one of his assistants on the Disney-MGM Studios Theme Park and got to work out in the field. And we just celebrated our 35th anniversary a few weeks ago in Orlando.
Oh my God, where do the years go? Goes by so quickly.
So let's set the machine. We know, Richard, 1949, the story starts, Tennessee, but we're here and you just drew a picture and your dad is like hanging it up in his office. Tell us what's going on. Were you drawing when you were a kid?
That was a dichotomy between music and visual arts.
Okay.
And so in my house, music reigns supreme. And every time I sat down and played the piano or, one of the many musical instruments my dad had around the house, my dad would walk by and he would say, "Oh, your embouchure's a little off today. Geez, your tempo's off, and you need to tune that trumpet. You never tune your trumpet." So it was much easier to draw, a picture, and he would just enthuse over it like crazy. He would take it to the office. When I visited him at Dot Records in Hollywood, he would have my pictures all over the wall. So I guess one day I decided, wow, this is a clear direction that I know I need to take, for approval. And so I started drawing. I started drawing to please myself. I started drawing monkeys and animals. There was an animal encyclopedia. And I remember one summer I said, I'm going to draw every animal in this encyclopedia. Wow. I made it about halfway through because of my attention deficit disorder, but I got most of them done.
Now, for those who don't know, tell us who your dad was.
Oh, my dad was Billy Vaughn. And even though I'm a Richard Smith Vaughn Jr., he was always called Billy. He came out of Glasgow, Kentucky. And when I was little, he worked at a dry cleaner's, and we didn't have much money. And I think I told you the story of my mom would make a big deal out of mayonnaise sandwiches. She'd say, "What are we having for lunch today? We're having mayonnaise sandwiches," because we couldn't afford to put anything in between. And so we were like the Beverly Hillbillies. My dad wrote a song called "Trying." It went to #1 on the Billboard charts, and then very quickly he became the musical director for Dot Records. And then from Glasgow, Kentucky, Bowling Green, Kentucky, and Gallatin, Tennessee, we moved to Sherman Oaks, California, on a cul-de-sac. And then we moved to Encino, and my parents bought William Bendix's old house on Encino Avenue. And we were like the Beverly Hillbillies. The house was so big, we only had furniture for 3 rooms. And it was 2.5 acres in Encino, and I had the whole place to myself. And my parents were embarrassed because they were Southern and they weren't all that educated. And so they didn't hang out with Hollywood people. So basically it was a very insular growing up. And I had my little drawing desk, which I still have. And so that's my early childhood anyway.
Wow. Did you guys have a cement pond in the backyard?
We did. We did. And my dad hated the heating bill, so he never heated it. So we rarely went swimming.
That's great. So in your collection, we saw a photo of you at Disneyland as a child meeting the spaceman of Tomorrowland. And it turns out there's a little story here.
It's funny because there are random connections in my life that I'm always so, busy doing stuff, and I've never stopped to think about it. But this picture I found when we made a house move, and I took it into work and I asked Randy, and he started laughing. That is Randy Bright, Executive Vice President of WDI. And the little fellow on the right is me. My cousin from Mississippi is just to his right, and then my little brother is on the right-hand side of the screen.
Wow.
And what year was this?
1962.
Wow. Well, I could have seen that right there on the side of the picture, of course.
So you played trumpet in the marching band in high school, and
in high school, until I got braces, and then it hurt too much.
And then you were going to go to dental tech school, is that right?
No,
because the braces hurt.
Get rid of the braces.
Well, I'm really happy you raced through difficult school years right with my graduation. But I spent a year out of high school as a neophyte hippie, and then my draft number was dismal, and so I sat down and I thought, well, instead of losing control and being drafted, I would control my destiny and I would enlist in the Navy, because on the open ocean there's no bugs, there's no jungles, there's no tigers, there's no guns.
Right.
And,
smart.
So my aptitude test showed that I was good for a couple of things. One was sonar technician, that meant submarines, and then the other thing was dental technician or hospital corpsman. And so I was made. I was a hospital corpsman, and
wow.
And of course, corpsmen at the time were connected to Marine units, and we went into the bush with Marine squads. Wow. So Marines don't have their own medics. There was always Navy medical corpsmen. And I was lucky enough to get stationed at U.S. Naval Hospital, Guam, and I worked for the only board-certified plastic surgeon in Westpac, and we did surgery on Marines with massive facial casualties, facial wounds, and usually 11 hours a day, 10 hours a day. I did that for a very long time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, so the strange question, but I'm sure that, it definitely had an effect on your character and formed, aspects of who you are. But anything out of that experience that you took with you that later, helped you or informed how you were later on?
Well, it dissuaded me from going to medical school, first of all.
Okay.
I had enough. And then second of all, when I got back and lived in Los Angeles, when I got out of the Navy, I had to teach myself to stop assisting in traffic accidents.
Oh.
I did that several times. I went, you got to stop. So anyway, other than having, I think PTSD generally with surgery and that kind of thing, but it also, I had these dreams that I was back in the Navy and I had really long hair, and I was always getting busted, and then I'd wake up.
Yeah. All right. So you became an art major. You went to Cal State Northridge.
Yes.
And then you moved to Oregon.
I moved to Oregon. Yeah. We bought 10 acres on the Little Applegate River, and I began working. I think my first job up there was for a concrete mason. I finished concrete for a couple of years. Then I was a maintenance man for Southern Oregon University. Wow. And I worked for the BLM, and the maintenance man job was interesting because it was mostly on the dormitories, and they were co-ed at the time.
Okay. So you saw some stuff.
I saw some stuff. That's okay.
You saw some stuff, I'm sure. Well,
so you were married. You were married at this time, and you had a son already, right?
I got married in '74, and we had our son in 1976.
Wow. Okay. So then your wife wanted to go back to San Diego, and then
she finished undergrad. She wanted to get her master's in theater, and she chose. We didn't want to go back to Los Angeles right away, so we went to San Diego, second best thing, and so that's where I got my BFA at San Diego State University. At one time, I was going to Claremont College, and then University of San Diego and San Diego State. I was carrying 22 units, and I was carrying 22 units because my GI Bill was about to run out. So I had to cram everything into that last semester. I don't remember much about it.
Jeez. So were all your studies in illustration, or were there different aspects of
Joe,
art?
It's really funny. I gravitated very early when I went to University of Oregon. I was really drawn to printmaking.
Interesting. Okay.
And then and because I think I'm basically kind of a frugal person, I was able to keep one piece of artwork and then sell 188 more.
Oh, right.
Smart.
That was the immediate appeal. Also, it's process oriented, and I have pretty severe attention deficit disorder, so I would hyper focus. I'd lock in to the step-by-step process of lithography and etching or intaglio. And I just love the process. And I remember actually when I was a student, I just remember being fearless in terms of subject matter. And, you know, we all were, I think. And it wasn't until years later when I retired and I had this studio that that I realized I was really having a struggle between design and art. Yeah. And I had to really sort of wrest myself away from the notion of my art having a purpose or utility or an entertainment value. Okay. And it took me a while to just start expressing myself. Yeah. And so you have to be deprogrammed. When you live your life, most of your life as an Imagineer, it's really hard to step away from the design thing.
Yeah. Yeah. But don't you think that that process that you were so attracted to helped you in your next life as an Imagineer? Because so much of what we did in Imagineer was all about process.
You know, this is interesting. I think the one thing that helped me get ready for Imagineering was working at Harry and David's fruitcake factory.
Okay, that's a quote we've never heard before.
Yeah, let's hear this.
And that's like Jimmy Pickering. I interviewed Jimmy Pickering at WDI, and he was very young and just out of school. And I said, well, Jimmy, and he was really interested in working at WDI. And I said, Jimmy, well, what are you doing right now? And he said, I'm working at customer service at Sears. And I went, that is perfect preparation. Working at WDI.
Well, you know, Eddie Sato always talks about his time at Sears selling washing machines.
Right. Really?
How formative that was. Yeah.
There's threads of connection there.
There you go.
So let's find out how you got in there. So you moved back to LA, and it's about what, 78, 79, and you're going around meeting production designers.
No, as I mentioned, I panicked, and I thought, you have just spent 4 years in a completely useless preparation for life, and you have a son, and you have a wife, and you have responsibilities, you idiot. And you know, you're not a musician. So I knew a guy that was a boyfriend of one of the kids that my wife went to school with, the girl, and he was a production designer at Warner, the Warner lot. And I met him a couple of times, and he introduced me to one, and I've forgotten his name. He's Joe Hurley. Joe Hurley was an illustrator, and they were working on a film. And I got to walk into the studio a lot and go there and visit. And I went, this is okay. If you put everything together, this is everything applies to what I know, what I like, what I love. And, you know, I wanted to become a sketch artist at the studio. And at that time, the roster was full. I almost got a job on The Postman Always Rings Twice with Jack Nicholson. Wow. And there was one person left on the roster. And I think George Jenkins was the art director. I didn't get that job. I met another, Harold Michelson, and I'll tell you something. Harold Michelson, I met him on the Paramount lot. These guys were always so nice, and they always took the time to talk to me, and they always looked at my portfolio, and then they would tell me, you know, it's a union thing, you can't get in right now. And but Harold Michelson was working on a movie called Can't Stop the Music. And he had this beautiful big sheet of drawings, which was a camera direction exercise of people dancing and doing hip hop and everything else. And you could just see the camera moves, and the format would go down the page. And it was a beautiful sketch. And it was so quick. And he had a cigar running in his ashtray on the drawing table. And, you know, he said, I'm going to tell you something. And he said, I think you might find this useful if this is what you're going to choose to do. And he said, never fall in love with your own work. And he said, because by the end, you've got all kinds of hands molesting it, touching it, shredding it, cutting it up. And it's very rare that your idea that you've fallen in love with is going to remain intact. It's not a child. You know, it's just an idea. And he said, you're supposed to have 8 million more in here. Right. And so he said, you have to be able to do this. And he took that drawing and he crumpled it up and he threw it in the trash can. And I went,
wow.
Wait a minute, you didn't have to do that for my benefit. And he goes, that's okay. They weren't going to use it anyway.
Wow.
But
Best
the one
advice.
thing that anybody told me that served me well thereafter at Imagineering and my whole career was just never fall in love with your own work.
Yeah.
You know, and it's great for collaboration. And, you know, I've seen people melt down when, you know, their ideas weren't used.
Yeah.
And so you just have to know that there's a million more where that came from.
Right. So it's
Great
1979 and we see you here interviewing with the great Maggie Elliott at WED Enterprises. How did you get in to see Maggie?
Well, I told you that I was on a journey seeing all the different production designers. One person that I had an appointment to see was a guy named Bob McKeegan, who was the production designer for Roots, the original Roots miniseries.
Wow.
And he was at this place called WED Enterprises in Glendale. And I went, got to drive all the way to Glendale. I was in the West Valley at the time. And so I made it to Flower Street. I parked my really crummy BMW, beat up BMW in the parking lot, took my portfolio into the lobby, and I walked up to a woman named Millie. And I said, I'm here to see Bob McKeegan. We have an appointment for 2:00. And she picked up the phone and called, and she said, oh, I'm sorry, Bob's gone today. And I just took a deep breath and, okay, bye. And she said, oh, you might want to talk to Herbie Ryman. And I said, and I said, I don't know who Herbie Ryman is. And she said, well, he'll be right down. So the door opened upstairs, and he walked down that flight of stairs, which at the time was part of the lobby. And he was wearing I'm not kidding, he was wearing a smoking jacket and had an ascot.
Of course, it was Herbie, of course.
And so he sat down with me, and he was the sweetest guy, and he was so supportive. And he diligently just went through all my self-indulgent student artwork. And then he paid particular attention to a series of photographs of a stop motion movie that I worked on at the Rose Avenue Firehouse in Venice. And it was a stop motion collection of animated films, but the tie-in between each animated film, which they were really weird, was this two characters that were living in the Lower East Side, Manhattan. And it just followed them and their random dialogue about dating and women and everything else. It was completely ignorable. But I did give me some experience in stop motion. And one afternoon, Carl Bressler, who's the producer, said, I want to introduce you to this kid we're bringing out from Detroit. And he'll be in after lunch. And his name is Michael Sprout. And he brought this Michael Sprout into the studio, which was the old Rose Avenue Firehouse. And Michael was going to be the head animator for the stop motion figures.
Wow.
And so I got to know Michael that day. And at the end of the day, after Michael did his test piece of two guys walking down the sidewalk, and then I got a chance to try my hand at it. And so I did my little effort, which I think was about 2 hours long. And at the end of the day, that's walking down the sidewalk.
Wow.
And at the end of the day, Michael said, well, you know, Michael's the sweetest guy in the world.
Oh, yes.
And he's not one to get upset at anything. And so Carl Bressler was an amazing jerk. And he asked Carl, he said, well, you mentioned something about you're going to provide housing, and I had my suitcase, and, I was wondering if you might be able to give me a ride. And Carl went, oh, I didn't do that. Yeah. Okay. So, you should probably really talk to one of the homeless people, because they can, they're really good at finding places to, to sleep. I went, Carl, are you kidding me? You just brought him out here from Detroit. And what are you going to, he's supposed to sleep on the streets? Wow. And so I said, Michael, I'll, hop in the car, I'll take you. And I took him to a hotel, and I got him set up, and then I helped him do a house search on the west side, and eventually he found a place. But then years later, Wathel Rogers was looking for new animators to hire, and Michael's background at stop motion, I gave Michael a call and put him and Wathel together, and Michael was hired.
Wow.
Connections.
All good karma. Yeah.
It's all about connections.
And what goes around comes around. And, all those good deeds pay off. Yeah, that's right.
So you got hired for the model shop and when?
Oh, yeah. I didn't finish that story. I'm sorry. Yeah. Herbie Ryman walked me to, he said, after he looked at these photos, he said, you need to go talk to Maggie Elliott in the model shop. And I went, okay, whatever. And he said, come on, I'll walk you down there. So he walked me down the hallway, and walking down the hallway, I looked at all the silkscreen posters. And I said, oh, damn, that's Big Thunder Railroad. And that's Swiss Family Treehouse. And I said, Mr. Ryman, what is this place? And he goes, wow, this is Wed Enterprises, Walter Elias Disney. This is where we design all the rides and attractions, and everything is designed here. And I just froze. And then he said, and right now we're working on a big project. And with a dramatic flourish, he opened up the model shop doors. Remember the double doors?
Yeah.
There was a site model for EPCOT Center.
Wow.
And, it's a cliche, but I heard this chorus of angels singing.
That happened to me.
Little light from the heavens came down. I sort of glided into Maggie's office, and she looked at those photographs of we made those buildings out of plasticine clay and pegboard. And we made 3 blocks of Lower East Side Manhattan. Of course, we limited just to where the camera was looking, but she liked the picture. She asked me what scale it was. I said 1/2 inch, and she said, well, okay, we'll call you. And the next day I got a call.
Wow, that's cool.
From HR.
Wow.
And I think I was hired for $268 a week.
Yes.
I think it was a week. No, it was every 2 weeks. I was wrong.
No, really? No. Wow.
Yeah, but what year was that?
The first day in the model shop, I had my cubicle, and I went to go talk to George, the guy who was the head of the tools where you handed out the tools. They gave me a Kennedy cabinet and a bunch of tools, and Eddie Johnson walked me around and introduced me to everybody. And as soon as I sat down, I called my wife and I said, they're paying me to do things that most people do as a hobby.
That's great.
Yep. Wow. So what was your
first model I worked on was the first model that they assigned me to was the rising platforms for American Adventure. Oh. And that's when I discovered EMI plastics. And remember, I had no experience model making. I had no experience with theme park design. I had just come off of an animated film, and before that, I was a carpenter and a concrete mason.
Wow.
Yeah, but when you think about it, all those skills work to support what you were doing.
The first time
WDI.
The first time I walked on the construction site at EPCOT Center, one of the leads for Buena Vista Construction Company tried to kind of hand me a line. He was saying that, we need a board stretcher for this. It's not available. So we're going to have to come back tomorrow. And I went, and his name was Red. And I said, could we go over here and talk? And I said, Red, I was in construction for 4 years before I went back to school. And I said, I pretty much know my way around. He goes, okay, right, fine. Back to work.
Wow.
Great
so then
story.
You got put on the icon of EPCOT, Spaceship Earth.
I was assigned Spaceship Earth to the rough study model. And at that time, John O'Lim was the creative lead on it, because Spaceship Earth had a very difficult birth. And it went through a lot of iterations. Everybody got involved, including Ray Bradbury, and a lot of luminaries, put their hand in. John O'Lim did a series of flowing illustrations that went from caveman all the way to present day. Wow. And much like a James Michener novel.
Yeah.
And
wow.
And of all the people who worked on it and they got frustrated or got moved around, you know, John Olim was the last creative lead executive that was working on it. And he was difficult to work with. Mainly the language was a big issue because he was Korean and his English wasn't really that great at the time.
Oh.
And I, for some reason, got along with Jono. A lot of the leads in the model shop, you know, they just had enough, and they had other things that we were very busy. So, you know, I was the I was assigned to the orphan project, you know, with the difficult creative lead, and it just worked out.
Wow.
You know, and that's when we started the 1-inch model. And the 1-inch model, because you're building inside a ball, had to be broken up into different sections. That's me inside the. It was really claustrophobic. And Jono, you know, he's Korean. He loves garlic, and so I'd be inside that little space, and Jono would go, "Really, you like it?" He'd breathe on me every morning. So I actually started, you know, fighting fire with fire. So I would just have garlic with my scrambled eggs, and that's me on top with my 70s porn mustache with its own zip code, and that's Ed Levins down below.
Oh, wow.
That's John Olim and me in the middle, and then Marty Sklar.
Oh, wow.
And that's a Phoenician. Oh, no, that's a Greek theater guy, a model.
Oh, right. Wow. So then you got to follow the project right here. Now you're building sets and you moved to Tahunga.
Yeah, when the transition from 1-inch model, basically everything was approved with very little changes. And it was, you know, for a first experience, it was great for me. But then I could not see remaining, you know, in the model shop and taking on something else. I wanted to go with Spaceship Earth to the Tahunga production facility. So I didn't really ask anybody. I just set up a desk and a table, you know, asked Mike Morris and Matt Pretty if it was okay. And, you know, I think the expectation, they were really appreciative that I was going to come with the model effort to transition into production.
Right.
And my construction background really kind of helped. And so I just, you know, dove in.
Wow. Well, that's great.
So Richard, yeah, that was such a complicated, you know, structure, you know, and, you know, being inside of the geodesic dome. And I always remembered early on, you know, Marty always say, you know, 70% of our projects are made in the field, you know, even though we do the models and we do the, you know, all the drawings. I mean, how much did you guys have to adjust what you thought was going to be the design once you got to the field or got to Tahunga?
The spatial constraints were worked out on the rough study model. And when we did the 1-inch model, we always, you know, was always cross-referenced with Gordon Hoops, the principal architect on it. It was always cross-referenced with the actual facility drawing. So we knew the limitations of where our stage platforms were. And like I said, they were stepped almost like rice paddies up a hill. So, and the other thing was the really close, the tight quarters meant that we were spraying flat black everywhere. I think we used a couple of million gallons just to make the facility go away. Wow. And we also kept the lighting levels down low. And Joe Falsetta, you know, he was a lighting designer on the model, and that he said the model informed his every decision about lighting in the real facility. And for the real show. So
and speaking of lighting, wasn't the first time you guys started mixing UV with incandescent?
Yeah, we did. That was following the strategy of keeping the light levels low. So, you know, if you could substitute UV paint, for example, that was painted in a single direction, like a light being broadcast, then it really kind of helped the dimmer levels. We were able to take the incandescence down lower. And then I told Ryan, and the Renaissance scene was ready for review at Tahunga, and I think they almost painted it overnight. But they had some theater people there, and they were used to painting, you know, dimensionally and with light and shadow and everything else. But we had props, we had tables and chairs and, you know, set pieces. And they painted the highlights on those, and they painted the shadows on those. And the remarkable thing about that is when you do that, it completely flattens out the actual real dimensions of the furniture. So Joe Denton was the lead painter on that. And I said, Joe, could you come here? I said, you know, we spent a lot of time building these props and furniture and everything else. I said, does this look, and by the way, Joe has passed away, rest in peace. But I said, does this look dimensional or does it look like a flat painting? And he went, oh, damn. And they went flat and we had to repaint everything. Wow. And so that was another lesson for me. If you paint a dimensional object as a dimensional object with highlights and shadows, then it tends to go completely 2D.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Interesting. Yeah. So you moved out to Orlando and you got to work with some of the greats out there, huh? Like,
yeah,
like
all the 9 old men were there at one time or another. And I went with my personal hero, John Lindsay, who came from Tahunga, who had worked on that. John Lindsay's greatest aspiration was to never wash his national rent-a-car while we were the entire time we were there for this, you know. And then John eventually went on to Tokyo Disneyland. The rest is history. He became a major mover. But John and I had a blast, and we, you know, I'll tell you a story. We went by the schedule, obviously. So and we didn't have telephones then. Everything was the walkie-talkie.
Right.
And so that day I was supposed to work with one laborer on a scaffold to place the stars in the Psyche behind the Phoenician or boat scene. And there were a couple hundred. And so I was sitting in the ride vehicle to get the POV, right? And he was up on the scaffolding, and literally he had his finger, and I go up a foot, and he'd go like this. And I say down a foot, and he would go over to the left. I said, no, down. And I said, oh, this is going to take forever. And so at lunch, I went to Big Five and I bought a pellet gun. And at the time, you could get a CO2 gun with darts. They came with little darts that had a fletched tail on them. Oh. And so I snuck it into the building, and I told the guy, I said, you know, I think pretty much you can go back to your foreman and see if there's another assignment. And I sat in a ride vehicle and loaded those little darts one at a time, and I placed the stars, and they stuck in the drywall. However, when I walked into the building with the CO2 gun, one of the security guards saw me. And then after shooting for about an hour and a half, 2 security guards came up, and they said, you know, we need to talk to you. This was before all the mass shootings and everything else. But he said, you know, you really can't, you know, have a pellet gun in the building, you know. And so when I took it back to the trailer, I gave it to Dutch, and I said, and he goes, got it. And he returned it to me the next day as a steampunk star location device. It had fake meters on it. It was brass colored. It had a little patina on it. Wow. It was amazing. There was some coiled copper on it and everything else. This is a fiber optic location device.
Right.
Fiber optic.
And they still do it that way, I think.
That's
really
funny.
Wow.
Wow,
that's great.
Brilliant.
So we cut to the chase.
Bro. Yeah. So okay, so we're running tight on time. So 1982, EPCOT opens, and as we all know, things get very bleak and dark at Imagineering. Tell us what happened.
They did. Well, I'll wrap up Spaceship Earth with all the executives went through, and then when they exited. For some reason that day, everything worked. The ride system worked, everything worked. We had Card Walker, we had Carl Bongiorno and everybody else. Marty and John Hinch were there. And as soon as they exited, they were running off to the next thing.
Yep.
And this is pre-opening. Yep. And then Marty stopped and he ran back to me, and John wasn't there, he's in Tokyo. And with the crew, I think Chris Martins was in it. He ran up to me, he shook my hands, and he said, it was a great show, and you didn't F it up.
Yeah.
And then he ran off. And I said, well, I guess that's it.
Wow. That's awesome.
Congratulations, Richard.
Thank you.
So you come back to Glendale.
When EPCOT ended, we had the budgetary crisis and everything else, and for the first time in a very long time, WED Enterprises had its first layoff, and then those of us who survived, most of us were kind of scrambling for job numbers and coming up with concepts and everything else, and so we went through job numbers were like gold. And so I then began engaging in a lot of different sort of creative, deep diving, and exploration. So this was we thought we would do a Black Cauldron. Remember that, Joe? Remember Black Cauldron?
I was an animator on it.
So
that's part of my storied career in feature animation. Yes.
So we tried to do a boat ride, and it was pretty intensive. This was going down the drop.
Oh. And
at the end there was a drop, and I forget the storyline. It looks like there's a baby being dropped up on that shadow.
Yeah, really.
I don't know what that is, but anyway, that was one of the pieces. There's a great background artist. I don't know, I can't remember his name, but I just copied his style.
Ralph McQuarrie. Was that the
No, that was the start.
Oh,
that
okay.
Was Tony Baxter's first attempt to pull in other characters, and this was pre Michael Eisner and Frank Wells. And so Tony thought we've run out of characters, we've exhausted everything, let's bring in some new characters and new, and talk to George Lucas.
Yeah.
And so he did some early stuff. Wow. I actually just copied Ralph McQuarrie's style, and I put them in the ride format. And so we were in a hurry. Our meetings, were few and far between. So we were going to meet with Marty and John and pitch this one, and I didn't have time to put the guest ride vehicle in. So they were just background.
Oh, okay. Wow. So 1984, Michael Eisner and Frank Wells come in, give Disney some new life. And you worked on the LA Children's Museum at some point around this?
Jane Eisner, God bless her, was on the board of directors for the Children's Museum, and Michael approached Marty and asked that he loan one of his creative leads to figure out an exhibit. So obviously the exhibit was going to be about animation.
Oh.
And so I met with Jane, and then I started pulling together some sketches and concepts, but basically it was an animation exhibit using praxinoscopes and zoetropes and for children to interact with. And the big challenge was having work tables for children that were basically indestructible, because I learned quickly that if you put a block of titanium in a schoolyard, it'll be worn almost in half by the time 5 years is up. Right. So we used a paint called Immeron at the time, which was an automotive paint, and we did a little pastel palette. And that was my first exposure to the art morgue at the studio. Oh. And I was going to do a neon Mickey animated across this low wall. And so I needed to find some, drawings of Mickey running, like full speed. Right. And I met with Leroy, who was the head of the art morgue at the studio.
Leroy and Cece.
Yes.
Yes.
And I said, I'm Richard Vaughn. I'm from Imagineering, Leroy, and thank you. Do you know of any sequences of Mickey running? And Leroy he says, well, that would be, that's Mickey and the little tornado. And you go over to aisle 3, and I think it's box number 2. And then none of that stuff was archival. It was a mess, and there was plywood and acid and cardboard and everything, and all that stuff was vulnerable. And when Michael Eisner and Frank Wells came on, they essayed all the properties around the studio, from makeup to, whatever was vulnerable, whatever's, costing too much money. And they got a report on the art morgue, and these guys came into the office with Jeffrey Katzenberg, Michael Eisner, and Frank Wells, and they were ashen. They were terrified. And they were like, so what's your verdict? And they said, how much is it worth? And the guy said, priceless. And it could be destroyed any minute. You have plumbing pipes running overhead. You know, it's in the most vulnerable place, and it's open to theft, and you know, it's just badly managed. And you know, you need to get that collected. You need to lock it up tight and get all that artwork into a safe location in an archival way, and it all has to be archived, you know, and documented. And that was the first time I think they realized what Disney had in terms of its, you know, intellectual property.
Yeah, that was the legacy of the studio. It was the legacy
from Steamboat Willie all the way up through the present day.
Wow, that's crazy. So, so one day I'm seeing like Rick Rothschild's calling you and wants you to go for a ride. Where are you guys going? And what are you talking about?
Rick Rothschild said, let's go to Tower Records and let's go have lunch. I need to talk to you. And Rick, we were driving, and he said, well, Marty had a meeting with Michael Eisner, and Michael Eisner made a request, and he said 3 things. He said George Lucas, Michael Jackson, and 3D. And I was kind of shocked, and I went, well, when you think about it, George Lucas, it's got to be in space. And you know, it's kind of a pedantic approach to it, but George Lucas, it's got to be in space. Michael Eisner, it's going to be him and singing and dancing. And I said, but you need a conflict. So how about Michael takes music to a place where it's not allowed, or, you know, it's wrong. So the initial concept was like the intergalactic music man.
Right.
You know,
interesting.
So the first concept that we came up with was, you know, Michael with his characters. Joe Rohde designed one, and Chris Runco designed another one. And then I designed a hand puppet called, and at the time I think they call it Fuzz Bucket or something.
Yeah.
And then Hooter was a jazz saxophone player who played his trunk.
Right.
And then they would jam. So that was the first concept for the first song, was just jamming in the equivalent of a Volkswagen bus.
Right.
In space, you know. And then they were going to get pulled in by a beam and, you know, punished for bringing music to this planet that was devoid of color and music and everything else.
Yeah.
And then Francis Ford Coppola got involved, and John Napier from Starlight Express and Cats came and worked in the model shop.
Wow.
And then it quickly evolved into some sort of grander, you know, 30 Years War kind of thing, and all involving and then do you remember who the evil queen was?
Angela
Houston.
Yeah.
So that's when Tim Kirk drew this sort of dystopian, you know, close palace scene with the queen hanging down.
Wow.
And then I did a sketch of, I did 2 illustrations, and we were really in a hurry because those guys were going to come and we had to do the presentation. So very quickly, I just used matte board because it's a medium tone, and I was able to pop it with some, you know, acrylic, you know, highlights, and then put base colors in. So the key illustration for me was doing Michael Jackson in the cockpit of his Volkswagen bus, or the ship.
Right.
So I remember, you know, he had his album cover at the time. It was like, this is going to be good. This is going to be a snap. And, you know, he was going to have the little character on his shoulder, and then the other characters were in the background. Now, I started to finish his lips, and, you know, that's easy to screw up. So I screwed it up. And then every time I tried to correct it, it got worse and worse, and I was getting frustrated. And so I just said, the hell with it. And I painted this big burnoose, you know, like a Bedouin, Bedouin warrior.
Right.
And because the eyes were good. I kept the eyes. That was perfect. But I drew this burnoose with a brass insignia, and it had it was like a surgical mask, but beautiful.
Yeah.
And that we had to go with that. But you could tell it was Michael Jackson. And then I did another one of him dancing, using music to create change and everything else. And those 2 wound up in the art morgue, but they couldn't sell prints because it wasn't allowed by Michael Jackson.
Oh.
And we had the presentation, and there were two other concepts. One was Michael as the spirit of spring, driving away the winter by gambling through the woods, and that didn't go over very well. And then the other one was Michael as a because he's a fan of Disneyland. It was a concept of having Michael go back into Pirates of the Caribbean after closing to get his jacket that he left, and then discovering that everything came alive at night. And so he frolicked with the pirates, and I don't know, we didn't develop much of a storyline other than that root concept.
Yeah.
And so Michael sat staring at my illustration with the burnoose, and then Jeffrey Katzenberg said, "Okay, Michael, you've seen the three concepts, and I know you have to get going, but is there one that you're particularly fond of, you'd like to work with?" And he said, I like this one. I like this costume, and I want to wear this costume. And so he picked that one, and it became Captain EO. But one evening, because it was always at night, one evening he came to do sound check in the theater, and he came with a mask. And I'm not taking credit for him wearing a mask, but he did wear a mask after he saw that illustration.
Wow,
that's great.
That's my Michael Jackson story.
That's great.
Wow. So let's fast forward 1985.
Yeah, 1985.
And Michael
go ahead.
And Eisner wants an entertainment pavilion at EPCOT. What did that evolve to?
We had an initial sort of command arrival. Randy Bright gathered all the available, the concept people and designers. It was about 12 people up in John Hinch's conference room upstairs. Right. And he had that one illustration that was the big wall, and then there was a movie marquee. And then he described what Michael wanted in general terms for EPCOT Center. And out of that meeting, Bob Weiss was appointed, and he took the lead, and that was the very beginning of Disney-MGM Studios. And for the next couple of months, 3 or 4 months, it was, Bob was heavily involved in the site location, in infrastructure, in all the major, difficult homework you have to do to start a project. It wasn't very exciting. I stayed with it on and off, but sometimes my attention deficit disorder I just could not talk about sewage and water mains and parking and egress and ingress. And so there were a lot of other things going on. So I kind of danced around, different concept meetings, some for Pleasure Island, some for, other projects in Florida, but a lot of them were all the other attractions that were the thinking that went into the backstage tour at Studio Tour. And, I got involved in that. And that we were dancing from room to room. That's Ryan. That's when I met you.
Yep. We met.
Soon George Head took over as the overall producer for the backstage tour. Yeah. And at one time I worked on the animation, the very early stage of the animation, because we're going to show all levels of production. But rather than show actual animation, because we were very dubious about getting animators to go to Florida and then have people walk through by the hundreds to watch them work all day long, I thought, let's have an interactive like the Children's Museum, oldies but goodies. And so I had to present to Peter Snyder, our concept for an interactive exhibits and for the guests to walk through. Peter Snyder did not like it. And so then we had another presentation, and I didn't take the warning. And so we had another presentation with Roy Disney and Peter Snyder. And I presented it again. And one particular thing was drawing, an animated sequence, kids could interact and put the zoetrope together. And I said, it's really so easy. Even Peter could do it. Oh. And that was on a Friday. On a Monday, I was off the animation. And which is okay, because I think at just about that time, we got a note from Michael Eisner that there wasn't enough going on in the studio tour. We were on budget and on time. but just, you know, with that kind of budget, it was pretty tight and there wasn't a lot going on. So he wanted a thrill ride on the backstage tour, or he wants some thrill attraction on the backstage tour.
Yeah.
And so I took that as a challenge. I grabbed a huge chunk of foam and you know, it's like flying everywhere. I started, you know, carving it out because I had this idea that, you know, Florida doesn't have earthquakes. It doesn't have mountains or canyons. You know, there's no natural features that could scare the hell out of you. So, you know, I thought, oh, you know, we could have a canyon and a flash flood, and not, excuse me, not a universal flash flood where, you know, it looks like a washing machine leaked and, you know, a little bit of water came down the road. So
wow.
Yeah, so I carved out, that's where the tram vehicles became for me a unit of measure, because I had to make sure that everybody on the tram had the same kind of really scary experience. So that meant an arc, and that was the basic arc. I used a little model of the tram, and then I worked backwards and carved the canyons, and I made sure that that the water would fold over itself as it came down. And this is when this is where the magic of Chris Brown comes in. Chris was the project engineer, and Chris and I were good friends. We knew each other. So, you know, he took me aside and he said, okay. He said, how much water? And I go, I don't know how much. You're the engineer. I don't know how much water. It's a big flood. And he goes, no, how much water? And I said, well, it has to be scary. And he goes, and he was pulling it out of me. He said, okay, what's scary? And I said, well, it has to be over your head. And he said, 8 feet of headwater coming down the canyon. I said, yeah, perfect. 8 feet. He takes out his calculator and he goes, okay, 70,000 gallons. And,
wow.
and yeah. And then, you know, the same thing with the fire and everything else. I think initially we had a locomotive, but then that switched to a tanker truck.
Right.
Of course, the tanker truck catches on fire and has to roll down toward the guests. Months later, John Gall, God bless him, was the rockwork guy on it. And at one point, you know, it's a movie set. So at one point, you know, I caught some of the rockwork, the plasterers, you know, working way behind the scenes on pillars, you know, sandstone pillars and everything else, but they were out of sight line. And I explained to John, I said, you know, these guys are working, we're wasting time. You're working on stuff that's not going to be appreciated by the guests. I said, it is a movie set. So much like a New York street, you know, you've got facades, but, you know, you don't have to fill the whole thing out. So I remember sitting in the ride vehicle and I said, John, take some spray paint and we're going to go through every canyon, and you take fluorescent paint and paint every place that I can't see. So he would paint a line on the plaster, and the plasterers were not allowed to work past that line. So we didn't waste a lot of time on the, you know, carving things you can't see. But, you know, at one point I took a walk up there. And so instead of carving the plaster, they did actually manage to carve some really explicit, nasty things in the plaster. Much like some of the porn in Pompeii. So they had their fun.
Okay, you heard that here, guys.
And then probably one of the most exciting days of my career of all time was when we had the test of Catastrophe Canyon. And those 70,000 gallon pools had giant gate valves that were 5 feet and with a single spindle in the middle, and they turned like that when the go button, you know, on part of the program. And that released all the water at one time. And so the lead time, they weren't ready, and we had our scheduled meeting. So we were in trouble, and there was no way they were going to get it to us on time. So Bob McDonald, who was part of the, you know, this special effects company that we used for the water drops, had said, oh, we'll just use Primacord. We'll just put a big plywood bulkhead there and we'll blow it up. And instead of being alarmed, Chris Brown and I went, yeah, let's blow it up. So came the test. All the coordinators were there with their cameras, and everybody was set to go. Chris gave a short speech. I gave a short speech. We all took our places. Chris climbed in a crane and sat in the bucket. No, not that one, not the first one. The first one, he was ready. He had to handle the whole thing, so he was not in the crane. That was when all 3 canyons were tested. And the countdown went 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we blew it. And one of our project, help me, Sandy Geiger's husband, I'm forgetting his name. I'm never going to forgive myself.
Craig Russell.
Craig Russell. Thank you.
Craig Russell, hello.
Craig Russell. He was sitting in his office, and he said this was like a half a mile away, and he said his entire office, everything was shaking when that thing blew off.
Wow.
It was huge. It was huge. And Sandy Geiger was on the plateau of the canyon when it blew. She was in a safe area out of the way of the water, and it went bam like this. It was huge. And it kicked up the layer of dust that was in the canyon already. It kicked it up about a foot. And then Sandy's camera shook, and she said the F word. And it was a huge success. Everybody was blown away, and it was big. It was like having a big toy.
Yeah.
And it was just exciting as hell.
Oh, that's great.
Wow.
So there's a story about the Brown Derby where there was going to be an animatronics orchestra.
No, that was it was not intended to be. It was just a proposal on our part.
Oh, okay.
As an entertainment aspect, but it was, it turned out to be pretty expensive. So, but our concept was to have a full big band, like a 21-piece.
Oh man, that would have been great.
Wouldn't that have been great? Do you know John
Oh,
Hurd?
God.
Do you know John Hurd's characters from the 20s?
Oh God, of course.
Yeah. So that was Tim Kirk's suggestion, was to have those characters in tuxedos, right?
Yeah.
And then a songstress would come up through the floor, and we would record an actual big band with a whole series of, all the big band guys at the time, Benny Goodman, all of those songs, and have a dance floor at the Brown Derby. And so the band was like a big music box. And so the trumpets would go, and these are full-size John Hurd characters, right? Yeah. And John Held. H-E-L.
John Held, yeah.
And,
it was the 1920s flapper look.
Exactly.
He kind of epitomized that look.
Right. Yeah. And it would have just kicked. It would have been amazing, right? And that's still doable if anybody out there wants to do that.
Well, Tim tried to pitch that and put it in the SS Columbia TDS too, which I thought would have been great there too as well.
Fabulous.
Yeah, because it was the same period. Yeah, it would have been great.
Oh, well, good ideas have just come around twice, 3 or 4 more times. That's all.
Yep.
That's right.
The Disney-MGM Studios opens in '89, and you got
I got one more for the backstage tour that almost nobody knows about.
Okay.
So this day we had a Herbie attraction on the backstage tour.
Right.
And there's not much you could do with a Volkswagen, but we had it pop a wheelie. We had it arrive right up to the edge of the tram, and it flapped its doors, and its lights blinked, and the wipers went on. Everything you could do with a car, that's what we tried to do. And it was, Herbie the Love Bug, number 53.
Right.
And I was on the tram that day, and I'm glad I was. We came around the corner on the residential street. Herbie the Love Bug was completely engulfed in flames. And he popped a wheelie, drove right up to the guest, and all the things we did to make it look animated and cute when it was completely engulfed in flames looked like it was writhing in agony and screaming because the tires were supposed to screech. And all the guests that day, I know there's video of Herbie the Love Bug completely engulfed in flames.
Oh man,
there's some probably really traumatized kids that like
I'm
Santa
sure. Well,
the
Roscoe smoke machine got too hot, and it lit the interior on fire, and then the whole thing.
That's hysterical. Oh my gosh. Oh.
Okay, so the park opens. You got to work a little bit on Disney Studios Europe, DSE, and then a proposed second gate for Tokyo.
A second gate for Tokyo that was really a command by Michael Eisner. And like good soldiers, we just went ahead and did what he asked. And we did not have the enthusiastic reception from OLC. Meeting after meeting after meeting, it was crickets.
Yeah.
And it was hard. it was hard. It was like being a nightclub comic and just nobody got it. Wow. And so we had different concepts, but basically the core idea was, applied to the Japan film industry. We wanted to work with Toho. So we picked The Seven Samurai as one of a key film for the Great Movie Ride, right? Oh. And so that we struggled for months. Robin Reardon was the overall show producer. That's a sketch I did for The Seven Samurai, and I think we did another one just post-war. That the Japanese didn't have that sort of boom that America had post-war. Right. And so, we tried to introduce some elements of American culture. So we kind of did a reverse engineering on Benihana's and did a backyard barbecue. And so this was
hysterical.
This was like the American dad with the socks and the brown shoes and and you could order off the grill. And, of course, there was a food service in the kitchen, but the featured character, the walk-around character, was this big American dumb dad. So I did a patio, and then as you'll see and hear some Tom Gillian influence in terms of the palette. Oh, Joe, you see the foliage in the background? Yeah. So that's a Southern California backyard, and that went over like a lead balloon. So anyway, that we got to the final presentation in Japan, and the head of OLC, said, and it was a lot of pressure on him. Yeah. And he said, "I'm sorry, I feel like a pigeon." I don't know. I think that was the direct translation. But anyway, that was it. And then thankfully it became Tokyo Disney Seas.
Yeah. Richard, and you remember I was working on Tokyo at the time, and I remember, the OLC saying after the fact, the Japanese don't want to know how the magic is done. And I think that was their basic problem with the whole studio thing, because it's about, hey, we're going to pull the curtain aside and show you how the magic's done. Right. But they go, no, they want to believe in the magic.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So then we get to 1994, and it looks like this is your last project as an Imagineer, Blizzard Beach.
Yeah, Blizzard Beach. And I picked that up. There was another lead. I can't forget what happened, but I worked. Kathy Bagman was the show producer, and we took it from just a very literal concept of an Olympic ski resort from a freak storm, and the snow was melting, and that's where the water park came from. Oh. Marshall Monroe was the one who came up with the concept, but it kept being pulled back to an actual, like we had timers on the sleds going to toboggans, with a winner and everything else. Oh, right. And it was like a step too far. And already the budget was, this is post-opening from studio tour and everything else. And so the budget was a constraint. The rock work was huge. And that was a big part of the budget. Let's see. I think the problem was my son. Are you serious?
Like 83, 84.
Oh, my son was involved with Taft High School. They went to the city finals. They won. They went to the state finals and they won. Wow. And that's when, it was, I was supposed to relocate, and I said I couldn't do it. And, I was told, this is not a really great time to refuse to relocate someplace. and so I was laid off, but the following weekend I went to work with Bob Lambert at Sony Pictures. Disney Pictures and Television. Okay. In designing a user interface for what was going to be video on demand with 5 telephone companies. And wow. We had to create a program guide, just like what we're used to now, but then it was new. Yeah. And so I worked with, let's see. Well, I can't remember the name because I'm ancient, but I brought some guys over from WDI, who were no longer there, and then I hired David Green to do the writing, and then Lynn Intamura was designing like a New York apartment, and that's the setting with a couch and furniture and everything else, and a big backlit backdrop of New York City to make it a believable living room, and that's where we're going to do the testing of the program guide.
Okay.
The end of the second year of my contract, I could not handle that format anymore. It's like working in a box, and I just, I couldn't do it. And they were trying to find me. I was running around the studio, and they were trying to find me to get me to sign the new contract. Finally, Bob called me into his office and said, he was mad at me and he yelled at me. And I said, I can't do this anymore, Bob. And he goes, well, we can still be friends. And so Robin Reardon called me from Universal Studios and asked me if I would work on Islands of Adventure. And because it was not a TV, I was thrilled. And I was the creative lead on Poseidon's Fury.
Awesome.
And that was massive in scale, and it was enormous. Mark Shoemate went through the entire scope of the scope of work, and then at the end of it, because the guests got on a ride, they got on a submarine, they did this. There was a whole temple scene. It was gigantic. It was enormous, and it was a spectacular. I asked Mark what the budget was, and he said 55 million. And I went, okay, we're going to have to pull this back a little bit. So I worked on it. Through that, I met Yves Pepin. We went to Paris to talk about the water screens. I love that guy. It was the most amazing trip. And he showed us his studio and everything else, and he was able to pull it off.
Yeah.
At one point, we rented the hangar, the dirigible hangar at the El Toro Marine Base.
Wow.
And that's where we did that transition scene from the climax inside the temple to you were back to the load area in front of the giant wheel.
Right.
Wow.
And so we dropped all 4 walls, we dropped it on top of the guest platform. And we needed a big space, and that was the temple scene. And that was at El Toro Marine Base. And I remember at the other end of the world's biggest wooden frame building, there was a lot of activity going on, and there was a giant dirigible. It was black, and it was really cool looking, but we couldn't go over there, and they couldn't come over here. Well, finally, one day we walked over. We'd all been in there for a while. And they said, what you're doing is really cool. We can't believe it. It's so cool. And then we were like, God, you guys are so cool. There's a black dirigible. It's like the coolest thing. So, yeah, it was for illegal immigration surveillance.
Oh.
And then we ran them through a show cycle, and they were like, wow, this is the coolest thing ever. And then we had the executives come over to see the effect. We had liquid nitrogen, we had fog, we had everything else. I did the setup. We ran through the show, and then one of the Universal executives said, this is really impressive, but I'm using a dumb voice, not on purpose. It's just the only one I could think of. But he said, this is really amazing, but what's it like with, a full show group on the platform with what if the platform is full of guests? How would that look? And I said, it would look like what you just saw, only you would be surrounded by fellow guests. Yeah. And that didn't go over well. And I sure hope he doesn't look. He might be one of the audience, but he did ask that. And so we had to gather everybody that was available. This is Chris Brown's efforts. This is Chris Brown doing his best, right? This whole effect was amazing. And so we had to grab anybody, Marines, people that were hanging out. We just grabbed everybody, and we put them on the guest platform, and we ran through the whole show again. And he went, okay, that's cool. Thanks. That was it.
All right. So
okay, let's move the time machine forward, because I think we're getting very, very tight on time.
We're already 14 minutes over. So in 1996, SpectraFX, where
SpectraFX. I was hired as a VP of show design, and we at the time were working on they were working on a project in Dubai called Magic World,
Okay.
And it was initiated and begun by Bechtel. And all the Bechtel people that had worked on Studio Tour, Juan Bofill, Jim Meek, and those guys were working on that. And they said, God bless them, they said, we will hook up with SpectraFX to do this job, but we need a creative lead that we can trust. And then I think Chris gave them my name, and they knew me, and they said, okay, that's it, let's go. So we started developing or refining their initial concept, or in other words, we wanted to make it buildable. And, so we got through that, but we got all the way through with a lot of trips to San Francisco and a lot of trips to Dubai. That was my first experience, one of many going to the Middle East. But there was an internal struggle between the Air Administration Ministry in Dubai and a couple of people at Bechtel. They were butting heads, and that project was canceled. That ruined SpectraFX. And then I did one project on Jeju Island for Spectra, and then I was off to work for Sony.
Right. So our friend Trevor Bryant calls you, and now you're at Sony, and
the job was, actually the job, as I understood it, was originally for Bob Weiss, and Bob Weiss, I think at that time, had gone back to WDI. But I was to have an office on the studio lot at Sony Pictures and Television, and I was to assist them as a liaison for their intellectual properties to be used and assessing other companies who wanted to use their intellectual properties for rides and attraction. My first one was Men in Black. And we know how that
interesting.
Out. And then the second one was supposed to be Godzilla, which was supposed to be a blockbuster. Sony rented out Madison Square Garden. We had the executives from Toho come, and we stayed in New York for that 4 or 5 days, and then we were waiting for all the various theme park companies to call us, and it was crickets. And so I was sitting on the studio lot in Sidney Poitier's office. I mean, the coolest thing I could do was go to the company store on the lot, but the commute from the valley was just murderous. It was just awful. So I eventually started going to Burbank at the Sony development office there more and more, and eventually we gave up that office, and I started to work on the Sony Center Potsdamer-Platz in Berlin, a music project that had taken a backseat to Metreon at the time because Metreon was under the gun. And a lot of the personnel and everybody were working on Metreon, but that left Berlin, like an orphan child. And so I had to go, my first trip, I had to go meet Andrew Woodmansee, who was the head of that project. And the first thing I got was a tirade. We have received nothing. We need, we've got a scheduled opening and we need to get going. So he educated me in the whole process and the background and everything else. And so I got to work, making that, at least pulling a concept for that. And one of the things that came out of that was Trevor had said that we're going to be doing a Beatles Yellow Submarine, attraction. And the early sketches were interactive music exhibits inside the Yellow Submarine as it moved. And those two things don't really actually work very well because
no,
even though it was a very slow moving, simulator.
Yeah. So
Darcy Pollock and I got on a British airplane flight, and we had a scheduled meeting at Apple Records. And I'm a Beatles nut. Wait a minute.
Oh, there we go.
This is my swag from Apple.
Yeah.
Oh, it's dusty. And anyway,
that does not look legal, Richard.
No, it wasn't. They actually have a basement full of illegal products that their legal department, confiscated. And so anyway, I was nervous as hell. I had to do a presentation with Darcy about our, the proposed concept for the Yellow Submarine. And I said, you know, I'm a little lukewarm about this, to be honest with you. And then I said, only because of the operational difficulty of people walking around interacting with stuff. I'm sure it could have been resolved. But then Neil Aspinall, it's funny when you watch somebody bitten by the bug, our bug, and Neil Aspinall is sitting there and he said, you know, Richard, why don't we let the guests go back to Pepperland? And maybe the Blue Meanies have attacked Pepperland again, and all the guests could go in the submarine back to Pepperland. And I went, you should be an Imagineer. And from that was the concept. Yep. And we worked on it from there. And we went back, we hired a crew of animators to do the scenery outside of the submarine, which was projected. And then very quickly, Apple Corps got Abbey Road involved to do 5.1 surround sound, and we designed the interiors. I think you have some shots of that. Yes, we had to follow the sort of lead design from the designer for the production designer for the original film. It was very simple, and it wasn't Peter. What's his name?
Oh, I know who you're talking about.
Remember the style?
It wasn't Peter Max. Everybody always thought it was Peter Max.
Everybody thought it was Peter Max, but it was
no. It was. Oh God, give me a second.
I know. I'm so old. I can't remember these.
Yeah, me too. Okay.
Anyway, I worked with him.
And
then we.
Yeah, Edelman. Edelman was his name.
Heinz Edelman.
Yeah, Heinz Edelman. That's
Heinz Edelman, and I hosted him in Berlin, and I took him around town, and he wanted to go to a miniature soldier shop, those little miniature soldiers. Yeah. And we waited. Andrew Woodmansee and I waited while he walked around the shop. He smoked like a chimney, and then he told us why the Blue Meanies were blue. And this is a new thing for a lot of people watching. The only reason the Blue Meanies were blue is because they ran out of red ink. They were originally going to be red as a sort of a political statement against the communist Berlin, Germany. So they ran out of red paint, and they became the Blue Meanies. And we opened. They invited several kids from the American schools in Berlin to go through the show cycles and see the Sony Music Center and the music box at Potsdamer-Platz. A brand new building by a vanity architect. And it was actually one of the coolest things I've ever done, was working on all the interactive exhibits. This was a water harp. When you pluck the strings, and it was a chromatic scale, when you pluck the strings, it was polyphonic. So if you hit more than one string, you could make harmonies and everything else. And so that was a big hit, except the floor got really wet. And then we actually at SpectraFX found, not SpectraFX. Yeah, it was SpectraFX. They were able to create an algorithm that was actually enabled you to look in the eyes of the musicians of the Berlin Philharmonic and conduct the orchestra. And you could choose 3 different songs, and you could control the volume with each section. But you cannot control the tempo, because somebody in the orchestra rightly figured out that people would just be jerks and make it go really fast. Yeah. So the only thing you couldn't change was the tempo, but it was really strange to stand up at that podium and look at these, world-class musicians staring right at you, and then starting in and doing the count, and then having them begin the symphony. Wow. That worked out really well. Opening was great. And then because Helmut Jahn was the architect, he did not allow signage to be put in the main concourse area of the Potsdamer-Platz, which is an amazing piece of architecture. But so people would get off the trains that would come from, far away to go see the Sony Center Music Box, which got a lot of publicity, and they couldn't find the music box. And, the attendance fell off right away, and that was that.
Now, Richard, didn't you guys do a version of the Yellow Submarine in Odaiba?
We
Tokyo?
did. And I keep forgetting that because I wasn't involved in that installation. Yes, we did one in Odaiba. And I don't know what happened to that. Eventually, I think it became something else. I know that
I think the whole
Water Harp
changed.
is now at the Sony Center offices in Japan. They moved it to Japan. So it's there in their, I guess, their lobby.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So,
so there were 2 installations. It's one of those photographs is actually of the one in Japan in Odaiba.
Japan,
yeah. So, Richard, we need to start wrapping up because we're 20 minutes late. 2000 SpectraFX closes. You helped start Contour Entertainment with Chris.
We started Contour Entertainment. Chris Brown, myself, Ted Burleson, and Bob Joslin began Contour Entertainment in Chris's house on Contour Avenue in Sherman Oaks.
That's where it comes from.
That's the name.
That's the name.
Yeah.
And we were working on a large entertainment project in the Middle East, in Dubai, and also we were getting ready to work on a major one in Doha. And then 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
And those projects were lost. And then, it just was playing catch up for the longest time. It just was a struggle for 12 years. At that time, I retired early.
Yeah.
In 2012. And then Desiree kept working occasionally for Contour. She did, my wife did a project in India, in Pune, India, called Fury of the Gods. And it was a complete sort of, it was inspired by Poseidon's Fury.
Yeah.
Let's say.
Right. So,
so there, Desiree is an amazing traveler. She was able to, in a hotel room in India in the middle of Pune, was able to make a cappuccino with a hotel iron and some milk. And she's a great traveler. She's tough.
Wow.
Anyway, I retired, and then very quickly, Desiree and I decided that we were going to eschew city life in Los Angeles, and we began looking for property, and we built this place. We moved here. I got here in 2015, and a neighbor across the road and I built the house and the studio. It took us 7 years. I ruined my shoulder, and I was slinging hammers and sawing and hauling timbers and everything else. But we bought 22 acres. We built the house and studio, and it's still wedded bliss. And she's relocated all the time, which is probably why we're still together.
That's right.
So, Richard,
wonderful life. So, final question
at the end, Joe and I always want to know, with all this amazing career experience, this wisdom, these lessons you've learned, what do you think, if you were to distill it down, what makes a guest experience timely
yet timeless?
Timely, I will tell you, I went to the Fox Theater as a child, and had my little brother with me, and I watched, I saw Dumbo, and I cried. I, was amazed at the rainstorm in the beginning. I was completely transfixed.
Yeah.
The theater was so crowded, my little brother sat on my lap.
Wow.
And we watched that movie, and it just knocked me out. Of course, moving to California and going to Disneyland, but of all of what came through everything was story.
Yeah.
And I think I told you that I learned in the Middle East that they have the same equivalent for Once Upon a Time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called, they say, Kanya Makan Fi Khadim Aziaman. And it means maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But once, long ago, there is a story.
Right.
And that's how every mother begins a fairy tale when they tell their kids a fairy tale to go to sleep. Yep. That became the sort of motto for Magic World. And it's story. Yeah. Again, it's story. And then story is all about connections as well. But if that's my one thing, it's story. It's just a simple word, but it means so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's in our DNA. That's great. Richard, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. This is a blast.
What a great ride. This is a great ride. Thank you so much.
I wish I'd send the time machine over here. I'll break out a 6-pack and we can, we can fly the time machine around Mora, New Mexico. I'll show you our exciting local dollar store.
Right.
Very exciting out here.
Well, we're going to be back in just a minute with Richard, but Becky, take it away.
Okay. You guys aren't like flying away somewhere?
Joe, where do you want to go? You want to go? Let's go. Where should we go, Joe? Actually, I'd love to see the Yellow Submarine experience when it was still open. So why don't we head to
Let's
Berlin?
go to Berlin. And Berlin's a great city.
Yeah.
Party time.
City.
Okay,
all right.
we're on
We're
our
gonna go to
way.
Berlin.
Okay.
Back in the
Very
90s.
good.
See you guys.
Perfect.
Bye.
Oh my gosh, hysterical. All right. Well, we hoped you enjoyed the ride. Thank you so much to our friend Richard Vaughn for time traveling with us today. And if you have questions for Richard, stick around for our live Q&A in just 60 seconds. On behalf of Zeitgeist Design and Production, we thank you for spending an hour of your time with us on the Spirit of the Time Zoomcast. If you enjoyed the journey, please check out all 35 of our time travel adventures on our YouTube channel or under the Zoomcast section at zeitgeist-usa.com. They're also available as podcasts wherever you listen. So open your diary now and plan to join us next month when our passenger will be longtime collaborator of Richard's at Walt Disney Imagineering, SpectraFX and Contour Entertainment, creative engineer extraordinaire.
And my buddy.
Brown. That's right.
Get it.